podium, please, sir. Thank you. How's the garden growing, man? There was a full moon the last time I went, so I was able to see it in the night. Is it? Yeah, good. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. So, Madam Speaker, this is like intermission between people who are going to speak substantively on this bill. Yeah, I really, well, I'm a senior. You know, I have to work myself to get my, you know, up there like the, like
on the bill as long as
yeah,
all of them speak on the bill.
yeah, like the Baptist preachers. You know, you start off low and slow, and you work yourself up into a passion. But the point at which I was joining issue with the Member of Parliament for East Grand Bahama, and I walked over to him after the break, or at the start of the break, was the question which is really a moral question. Because at the heart of this whole debate, we are engaged in a war as such, a political war with the European Union and these developed countries over the banking system. And I think it was the Minister for Immigration who was saying that this is not about their moral concern about whether we are doing good or whether we are doing evil or whether we are stealing or whether we're engaged in fraud. This is outright competition, which they are trying to stifle. I believe that with all my heart and soul, that they are trying to eliminate competition in this part of the world by them. And it's a set of rules which apply, those rules are unevenly applied. Like, for example, you have to ask you, why don't you go pick on the US if you're so bad? Why you don't go pick on them? But they wouldn't dare, because Joe Biden would tell them where to go. But we can't. So there's this asymmetry that exists between us and them in the power equation, in the trade which goes on in the world. And you can explain it in so many ways. There's a fashion which goes with these things. So in and around, I forget when the first Summit of the Americas was held, and there was supposed to be this free trade agreement of the Americas. And the whole idea, I think Bill Clinton was the president at the time, the thing was held in Miami. And the whole idea was that across the Western Hemisphere, there was going to be free trade. All the barriers are going to be lowered. There would be no customs duties. You just move goods from one place to the next, and it was going to be the richest hemisphere as a result of this free trade area of the Americas. And so the fashion was free trade. EU signed a set of agreements, the Lome Agreement, then the Cotonou Agreement. There's now a post-Cotonou Agreement. Let's go to those first two agreements. The whole idea behind those was entry of the former colonies in a duty-free fashion into the markets of Europe. So everybody would be able to, the former colonies would be able to get into Europe without paying the taxes. Now, one of the consequences of this free trade idea, that there's supposed to be competition and this was going to lower the prices for consumers and all the rest of it. One of the consequences of this is that the banana industry in the Caribbean and the sugar industry in the Caribbean and Central America was absolutely destroyed. So these societies that had been agricultural, had been depending on it. Remember, the Bahamas was the only tourism country as such, but everybody else was agricultural based. And today, there are no cane fields, or very few cane fields, or the cane fields are restricted. Bananas have collapsed in Central America and here. And I remember Bill Clinton coming here and saying to Perry Christie at the time that that's one of the things he regretted as President of the United States with this eliminating these barriers to trade, because the barriers to trade actually allowed small countries like us to be able to keep ourselves going. So anyway, that was the fashion. And everybody was free trade, free trade, free trade. And then there came globalization. There's another buzzword. So everybody was running over to China because labor was cheap and you could import things in there and you could sell them back here cheaply. The Free National Movement Administration got religion on that point too. So Hubert Ingraham comes in and changes the agricultural policy of the Progressive Liberal Party, which was before, which heavily subsidized agriculture and bought anything that you produced, peppers, oranges, whatever. You just take them to the packing house, Produce Exchange, bought it, and you did it because you didn't want to denude the populations of the islands, so you kept farming was a way of subsidizing. Well, Bill Allen was the finance minister, and he and I had a spirited argument about this. He said, look, why should we be wasting time trying to grow chickens in the Bahamas when they could grow it more cheaply in the States? And that's true. At the time, you were paying, I think, $1.29 a pound or something for chicken in the Bahamas. And the thing is, you could put up as whatever barrier to trade you wanted. The U.S. could dump produce in the Bahamas, and in other words, they could do it more cheaply than we could ever produce it. But there are reasons why we wanted to produce food here, which did not become apparent until 9/11. And when 9/11 took place and the ports in the States closed down and the warehouses in the Bahamas were running out of food, suddenly said, oh boy, we really should be growing our own food, which is now where we've now come back to that in this century and this year. So globalization. And then the European Union and the United States started to use what they call non-trade barriers. So they started putting health measures, and then they wanted you to put environmental measures. And all of these things were added. So if you didn't harvest the lobster in a particular way, if you didn't grow the chicken in a particular way, if you didn't, process it in a particular way, you couldn't get it into their markets. And of course, the Japanese had discovered this trick a long time ago. They tell you, yeah, we have a free market, you can bring it in, but you got to get through these health measures first, Uh-oh, there's a fly on that thing, you can't bring it in. So that's how you use non-trade measures. So the point I'm getting at there, though, is that there's a fashion with these things, and so the world goes in a swarm behind one thing or the next. And the people who seem to end up on the wrong end of the stick always is those of us in the Caribbean. No matter what happens, whatever you try to do, however you turn, they figure out a way to stop you from going in that direction. So the latest thing is Caribbean countries discovered citizenship by investment. Well, now the British have said, if you get citizenship by investment, Dominica, they ain't gonna let you in the country unless you have a visa. So that puts paid to that. And everywhere you turn, there's a block, there's a block, there's a block. So I had the trade portfolio for about 6 months before the 2007 general election. And it was my job to go down to a conference or a meeting of trade ministers, which took place for something called CARIFORUM, which is all the CARICOM countries plus the Dominican Republic. And the conference was hosted in Santo Domingo. So I went down there, and this was supposedly for us to show how we could qualify to get development assistance from the EU. So part of this Cotonou agreement and all the rest of it was Europe would allow you access to cheap money. I don't think we ever got any of it. I think Prime Minister Ingram may have gotten something in Acklands or something as I remember it, but whatever it was, you had to jump through 10,000 hoops before you could get the first euro. But anyhow, so, you know, our bureaucracy is quite slow. Grant writing is quite complex for these organizations. So I go down there, and I swear to you, Madam Speaker, I thought that I was like Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen when I arrived in this meeting. I swear to you. The European Commissioner on Development sat in a squeaky chair in a room with no air conditioning and a fan going in the top, and the fan was squeaking, just like the Humphrey Bogart movie, right? And he had, and to add insult to injury, he had on a blue seersucker suit. Do you know what seersucker is? With short sleeves and a tie. And he sat there, and he was talking to me. And essentially, he was lecturing me on how the Bahamas was so slow and how we couldn't take advantage of the money because we didn't do this application right, we didn't do the other application. Well, you know my mouth. I wanted to tell him he could take his aid and, you know, what he could do with it, right? But I was quite polite. I said, I listened to this rubbish. And I came back home, reported to my colleagues, it's simply not worth the time and effort because it just didn't add up to anything. But I describe that scene because what is emerging now from the intellectuals in our communities throughout the Caribbean is that there is a recolonization which is happening right before our eyes. And if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves right in the supplicant position again. So they had this thing which is called, part of these agreements, which is called a political dialogue. And we recently had the political dialogue. This is the first one that has taken place since the pandemic, which took place in October during Diplomatic Week here in the Bahamas. And essentially, it's all the EU countries come, they line up on one side, and the Bahamas lines up on the other side, and we are supposed to be having a dialogue. It really feels more like a report, like you are reporting to them what things the Bahamas government is doing to comply with all these strictures that they put in these agreements. So now, one of the things we raise with them, and every forum we go to, is this question of what are they doing with financial services? They're an amazing group because no matter who you ask, they say, it's not me, it's not me, it's not me. Oh, really? Is that what is really happening? Oh, I'm surprised. I didn't know that. What you need to do is to do this one, or talk to this one, or talk to the next one. But it all ends up being nothing happens. They just barreling down the road. So they told us in all these various fora that, well, you know, it's the European Commission that's doing it. It's not we who are the political leaders. So it's like, you know, the European Commission is this body which has no restraint, which just goes and does these things and ends up doing these harmful practices. The friendliest intervention that we had on the point was the Irish government, who's having the same issue internally with the EU, because taxes, corporate taxes in Ireland are quite low, low barriers to entry, and they see it as largely as a competition issue. And Ireland now has net inward immigration as a result of their economy doing so well. As a matter of fact, migration is causing them a problem. There were riots a couple of weeks ago in Dublin because the Irish local people are feeling that they're being displaced by migrants. But the country simply does not have the laborers to be able to handle the dynamism of its present economy. So there's that problem. And so every government, and particularly this one, is struggling about what do you do about these asymmetries, where basically, I know there's OECD and FATF and all these other fora, basically they simply dictate terms. They say, well, you see, we are now amending laws. Why are we amending these laws? Not because we want to, or we think there's anything philosophically sensible about it, but it's just that the terms have been dictated, and if we want parents to be able to pay their school fees in London without getting cross-examined about where the money's coming from, and you're from a jurisdiction that does all these various things. We just got to do it. It's as simple as that. And in struggling to find a way to deal with it, for example, we have a real practical problem with insurers, reinsurers in Germany, where as a result of being put on this list, there's a withholding tax before they pay the money, the reinsurers pay the money of 25%. So they just hold it because you are supposedly in a jurisdiction that's on a blacklist. And again, when we approached the German government, they said, what? Is that really what's happening? Oh, well, it's not us. It's just obfuscation, all around the mulberry bush. But the point is, nothing ever changes. So the countries, all of us in the Caribbean, have spoken to this issue. In some instances, some CARICOM countries have a difficulty even getting their checks cashed overseas because of de-risking. Banks in the developed countries are refusing to take monies from banks in these jurisdictions. So essentially what's happening is you're being boxed, you're being put in a prison. So difficult for you to get a bank overseas, difficult for you to trade overseas, difficult for you to pay your children's school fees, all of that. And the thing, I suppose that would be fine if it's just international trade that is involved in it. But the problem is it's created so many issues in the domestic theater. The main one is, which was mentioned here today, is the ability of us to open a bank account. I wanted to help the credit union join the credit union movement. And I said that I would attempt to start an account in a credit union and do a kind of regular deduction. So I go and I get the forms. They give me the forms. And when I looked at what I have to do to open this account, I thought to myself, why do I want to do that? My mattress don't ask me them questions. Yeah. They don't ask me where my voter's card is, and do I have an electricity bill in my name, all kinds of rubbish. You've been with a bank for 50 years, haven't moved a cent, and every year you've got to come fill out these stupid forms asking you these stupid questions about where you are and where you live and who you are and all the rest of it. And the problem is that our regulator, central bank, does nothing about it. They agree this rubbish, and they keep, it's just more oppressive. It takes you, I think some folk have told me, up to 6 months to open an account here. And some people simply give up. If you're a political party, God help you. If you're a political party, politicians are thieves apparently, right? More, no less thieves than bankers. But that's what we face as a result of this stuff. So the question I was asking the member for East Grand Bahama is about the morality of this, because I want us to be careful to not concede that there is some moral right which is attached to the European Union with this, or the United States on this. There's no moral right attached to it. And there's no moral negative attached to what the Bahamas does and the business the Bahamas is in. I want to make that quite clear. And not to concede that to them, ever. Not to concede that to them. Yeah, sorry.
Chair, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And let me also agree with member for Foxhill and make it very clear that I in no way, or I don't believe anyone on our side would accept that they have the moral right to do this. I think the only point that I raised, which is an unfortunate point, is if you do not do what they are asking you to do, there are, as you mentioned, with respect to the insurance, there are negative consequences to it. And so that is why you do it, to prevent those those negative consequences. But I accept 100% what you're saying, that there is no moral right that they have, and there's no moral wrong that we are doing, that we are committing. So I accept in that premise.
Right, and that's why I gave the story. I thank you very much for that clarification. That's why I gave the story about the fashion on free trade, because free trade meant that you were supposed to be able to compete by lowering taxes and by able to have less regulation. And that was the rush back then. Now it's all changed. We're going back the other way. As you know, the global situation has changed. You know, China's imposed restrictions, US has imposed restrictions. Everybody's now retreating behind barriers. So the fashion is worn out, and I suppose some other fashion will replace it. So, which brings me to the second point I wanted to make about, and this has to do with the comments of my godson today in the newspaper about the deficit and all the rest of it. So here's my take on deficit. The Tribune publishes a story. They go into the IMF report, and they find out it's actually quite a glowing report. So they find this little paragraph in there that says, the government has indicated that they're going to shoot for a 0.9% of GDP for their deficit in 23-24. IMF says that's overambitious given what's happening. We think it's going to be more like 2.9. And the headline then reads, government's deficit, or the IMF blows a hole in the government's deficit predictions. Well, you know, they're a newspaper, they're selling newspaper. That's fine. Now, it really fascinates me what this public becomes interested and excited about. Because all of a sudden, everybody's interested in deficits. Deficit, oh, you're running a deficit, and you're running a deficit. I don't know if they understand what a deficit is, or how it's connected to the way you run an economy. But, you know, there was this creed. I think Herbert Hoover, who was the president of the United States before Franklin Roosevelt, ran into problems when the markets crashed and the economy of the United States tanked. The question is, what do you do? The creed at that time was you could not have a deficit spending. You must balance the budget or be in surplus. So they did nothing. Roosevelt comes along. There's a fellow named Keynes who was an economist, and he said, well, governments, when there are bad times, what you do is you even out by deficit spending. And there's nothing wrong with deficit spending if it's kept within limits. So if the size of your economy is such and such, you can do a deficit spending to a percentage of your GDP. And that's been the creed. That brought the United States out of the Depression. And during the Second World War, of course, it really bumped up because their manufacturing capacity then increased to produce munitions and arms. Sorry? Exactly. You went and you borrowed. You borrowed. So deficit is not, again, there's this, like there's something immoral about a deficit. And there's nothing more immoral about a deficit. Because in my last, what I describe as my penultimate campaign, right? I spent, yeah. Say? I did say that, penultimate campaign. I went from port to port in this country. And people gave testimonies as to what they want. And I could tell you the list. Bridges and address. The roads need to be paved. Water, electricity. What else? Go to Eleuthera. Harbor Island feels that they're being underappreciated because they contribute such a huge amount to the economy. So you need a hospital in Grand Bahama. You need an airport in Grand Bahama. You need an airport in North Eleuthera. You need a dock fixed in Harbor Island. You need the roads paved in Eleuthera. In Acklands, you know, you need the verges cut back, water, power, phone. any island. It's the same thing. And this amounts, if you just take what is required, for example, in Andros, North Andros alone, requires something like $100 million. Got to be easily. Because I think one bridge to repair is going to cost $36 million, and that's only one. So, and then you have the results of the problems with Hurricane Dorian, where people's homes, their roofs, even in New Providence, people's roofs need to be fixed. Poverty has increased. Remember, in 2018, the central bank said people making $30,000 a year in this country reported that at the end of the month, 50% reported they couldn't make ends meet at the end of the month. So poverty, huge problem. And who is the spender of last resort, or even first resort these days? Is the government. And where are you going to get the money? Only two ways. You can raise taxes, you can grow the economy, or you could just cut back on spending if you're worried about deficits. You know, the Americans like to say, I don't want my grandchildren to be paying the debts of the country. The problem, of course, with that is that there may not be any grandchildren if we don't spend now to survive. So there's a balancing act. And if you look at the size of the Bahamian economy, there is no issue with deficit spending. And all the complaints which we have, when you start out, the Minister for the Public Service is tackling this with aplomb. But if you remember words, and I'm not prophetic, I just say that this is a fact. You know, Michael Manley told me in an interview I did with him in 1980 that, you know, the pace of change in Jamaica, the public administration simply could not support what the political directorate was trying to do. So in this country, the cabinet can sit down and decide it wants to build a school. Today, we want to build a school. And you have to count 24 months before the first shovel goes in the ground. Routinely. And Prime Minister Ingram had a methodology to deal with this, which is get up and cuss you out and say, you know, you better do this before I sit down, or else, you know, blah, blah, blah. Well, that only works, you know, after a while, you know, before people say, oh, that's Papa shouting again. They can't do nothing, you know. So that doesn't work. So there's systemic things which have to be tackled if we're going to do that. The IDB did a study once and said that one of the issues they found with our country is that too many things get kicked up to the cabinet to be done. So the cabinet's agenda is clogged with stuff that it shouldn't actually get there. Well, I lost that battle too, so. But those are the issues, and so I just don't want people to get so preoccupied about this stuff. Be assured that the mandarins at the Ministry of Finance, including those of the political directorate, are watching this matter and will not allow this country's finances to slip into such a place where we cannot afford for us to keep going. And the prophets of doom and gloom have to be dispensed. Notwithstanding their appetite to sell newspapers by sensational headlines. And similarly, I would say, in answer to the intervention by the member for East Grand Bahama about this council that's supposed to be appointed and what it's supposed to do. Remember the philosophical start that we had when we were in opposition. We said, all of this was an unnecessary bureaucratic imposition in a small country that we really shouldn't have. That it's all rubbish, right? Rubbish, you know. There's no such thing as independent. Don't happen. Not in this place. Not in this place. I told the Foreign Service officers last night, you know, when they were graduating, I said, let me tell you what's going to happen. If the regime changes tomorrow, someone is going to go to the new minister and say, look, This one is F&M, that one is PLP. This one is F&M, that one's PLP. As soon as he walks in the door, and some who are PLP can run and say, boy, I was F&M all the time. That's just how it happens over here. You know? So independent don't exist. And so you can put all the protections you want and all the rest of it. It does not exist. But these international agencies and organizations are always imposing these things on us. We must put this rule in, the next rule in, and the other rule in, blah, 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 blah. I don't know that it helps move the thing along at all. So now we have the post-Contenu agreement, and they're saying we should have signed it in November. We didn't sign it. The only thing I was concerned was, are you going to let the crawfish in if we don't sign it? They say, yeah, the crawfish can still come in. So we're studying it. But now they tell me that if we don't sign it, they can stop the political dialogue with them if we don't sign it by the 31st. So I guess we better rush and sign it so we can sit down and talk to them. But that's life.
Still want that crawfish.
Yeah, we still want the crawfish to come in. So anyway, that's my story this afternoon. I hope that this generation that's now taking over the House of Assembly will fight the good fight with all their might. Thank you.